I'm seeing this AI adoption for the purpose of mitigating workload, which I can stand behind that. But if that's the only reason why you're using AI in the field of education, nonetheless, we're only scratching the surface.
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech Podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech Podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by my Amazon storefront. I've pulled together more than a dozen lists of my favorite gifts, books, and spring cleaning items for educators. My collections on Amazon make it easy to find all of my books written by Easy EdTech Podcast guests, and so much more. Use the link classtechtips.com/Amazon to go straight to my Amazon storefront. That's classtechtips.com/Amazon. This week's episode is titled AI Strategies from an Instructional Supervisor with Amir Taron Ayres, a curriculum supervisor, ELA in social studies, also based in New Jersey. I came across an article that he wrote for Edutopia this past spring and invited him on the podcast to chat about the work happening in his district. He is tackling what AI means from an instructional lens and shares really actionable strategies alongside his perspective working with educators in a variety of roles in our conversation today. So let's jump into the episode. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to chat about AI and your role, right, as an instructional supervisor and all the connections there. But before we dive in, can you share with listeners a bit about your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Awesome. Sure. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to talk about AI and really anything involving education. My name is Amir Taron Ayres. I am a curriculum supervisor at a charter school in Camden, New Jersey, Leap Academy University Charter School. I supervise high school English language arts, as well as middle and high school social studies. My day-to-day kind of involves, overseeing ELA, social studies curriculum, the implementation of the curriculum, lesson plan checks, classroom visits, PLCs. Here we call them CPTs. It's common planning time. Education is full of all these wonderful acronyms. There's some coaching to what I do. I'm involved with PD planning, PD implementation. I also have the pleasure of doing recruitment for our district. I'm involved with the recruiting process, with hiring, some retention components, and probably one of the most important aspects of my responsibilities on paper is really just to ensure that our students are proficient, in the state standards that are measured through standardized assessments. So that's probably everything in a nutshell.
Yeah. And, given your perspective of working with lots of different educators, lots of different student groups, the ELA, right, component as we jump into an AI conversation, today we're talking about what's working and maybe not working with AI in schools. What have you seen in your learning environment related to AI use and adoption?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. We've been able to sort of come in on the ground floor of this. So I remember when, Chat GPT first hit,
Hmm.
and we immediately saw a change in student writing. But then what struck me, right, because my primary responsibility is to teachers. Of course, I'm serving students and families, but
Hmm.
in my day to day, I'm working more with teachers in this role. And what became really interesting to me is that I started to see a change in staff writing,
Yeah.
right? I started to see a change in lesson plans, and then I started to see a change in teaching materials. And so, when we talk about kind of like what's working, and I definitely think there are some great AI platforms specifically geared towards teaching,
Hmm.
like Diffit, like Brisk, things of that nature. And I also love the idea that teachers have more at their disposal to curate materials
Yeah.
outside of textbooks, right? Definitely, I'm always a proponent, stepping away from a textbook as much as possible. So I feel like AI has given teachers the ability to do that as well. But then if we're talking about what I've seen in AI, kind of fast forwarding to this past school year, what I noticed, from 24, 25 is really just a marked increase
Yeah.
of AI use, but among teachers and administrators, right? Students have been using AI, and there are teachers who were using it. I think this last year I saw, like an exponential increase
Mhm.
of AI use. So I really started to kind of dig into this idea of what it means to really refine like the effective use of AI, specifically as teachers and administrators. Because, while I'm seeing a lot more AI use, from my lens, from my vantage point, it
Mhm.
looks like I'm seeing this AI adoption for the purpose of mitigating workload,
Yeah.
which, I can stand behind that. But if that's the only reason why you're using AI in the field of education, nonetheless, we're only scratching the surface. And so that has had a major impact on my work over the last year.
And I love that point that you made that it's just, a part of the conversation here, right? The productivity piece. And, I feel when I work with educators and much of my work as well is more on the instructional side, right? What can teachers do behind the scenes, right? To prepare for these moments with students. This idea of productivity and saving time is great. It's like a first step, though, into these
Yes.
more intentional use cases, these things that are more purposeful for supplementing curriculum or textbooks, like you mentioned. And in your Edutopia article, that's how I first learned about your work, even though we're both based in New Jersey, not terribly far away from one another. But, in your Edutopia article, you make a strong case for using AI as a thought partner. And I love that idea of the collaboration, right? That can happen here. So can you share an example where that framing made a real difference in your work or something that you observed?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about that framing is the biggest impact that it made on my work over the last year re- really involves the work that I do with teachers and just planning, high quality lessons or solid lessons. And again, as I said, I started to see a change in what lesson plans would look like. And then, of course, there's always what a lesson plan looks like versus what the implementation of
Mhm.
that lesson looks like. But a lot of the work that I do, I work with teachers in my content areas in small groups, either based on grade level at the middle school level or just based, on content at the high school level. And in having conversations, I could really just see that lesson plans were being generated for the purposes of having lesson plans, right? And that's not a knock to any teachers in my district or anywhere else, because if you've taught long enough, you've got a plan, but you know what you're teaching, and they're not always the same thing. So I started to approach the work with the teachers specifically who were using AI the same way that I would approach the work prior to AI, but now kind of embracing it. So what I mean is, you've generated a lesson plan and the plan serves a great purpose, but, have you gone back to the standard that you're teaching? Have you taken that standard and unpacked it into some, rigorous and measurable goals, right? And are you basing your assessment first, right? Here's my goal. Here's my assessment of that goal. And then how am I going to teach it, right? So these are just the basics, right, of teaching. This is when I first started teaching, we sit in a room and unpack standards, right? And I think a lot of times that whole practice has gotten lost. And so rather than, and I'll wrap this point up, but rather than, going to ChatGPT or Gemini and saying, hey, give me a lesson on, no taxation without representation. Let's actually go back to the standard, right? And if you haven't learned how to unpack the standards, let's see how AI unpacks the standard, right? Let's see what goals AI is going to give us generated from the standard. Great. Now we've got these goals. All right. Now, how are we going to assess these goals? You can give me an answer on that, right? And I'd love to hear your answer on that. Yeah. Let's see what AI is going to say about that. Let's compare the answers. Let's refine that. All right, great. Now, how are we going to teach this, right? So the lesson plan that comes out of that process inevitably looks much different than, hey, give me a lesson plan on no taxation without representation, right? And so that's where the biggest impact on my framing has been through my work with teachers, in that regard.
And just as you're, talking there, I really love your emphasis on the process, because I think it's very easy to see one of these tools and to think about, what is it that I can do to just jump from A to Z, as opposed to have it as a tool, maybe alongside, two people sharing a screen and having a conversation in the same way you might sit across from one another and, talk about something in a mentor-mentee situation or a coaching situation, right? You now have this vehicle that can really drive, right, what you're trying to accomplish and be this third voice, if you will. Right? Yeah. And the examples you gave about connecting to unpacking the standards, on refining, right, your prompts so that you could ask the follow-up questions. When it comes to that prompt refinement, and treating AI like a collaborator, are there specific chatbots, specific tools, or just a great strategy that you found helps educators level up these prompting skills that they're building?
Sure. So if I can answer in two parts, the first thing I would say is I like to meet educators where they are, right? So different teachers use different tools. Most teachers I found over the past, and of course, this is anecdotal, but the teachers that I've worked with, most of them, know about ChatGPT. So they're using ChatGPT. So then I just ask them, have you ever tried Gemini? Oh, what's Gemini? I mean, you're not going to see much of a difference between Gemini and ChatGPT, but it's another tool. So you can kind of like play with, see the difference. And, a lot of teachers in our district, use Diffit, right? So you really have to go heavy into Diffit, but have you tried Brisk, right? So as far as the prompting and engineering prompts and what platforms the teachers are using, I'm usually trying to meet them where they are and then give them like a little bit extra on top of that, right? So here, you tried that. Let's work on this together. This is what you're comfortable on. Hey, when you have some time, try this, right? Here's something I did with this. You could take a look. And one thing I love about, ChatGPT, Gemini, a lot of these platforms is that I can just send you a link to the entire, session that I just had. And that's been a great training tool. But I think the bigger question about just prompt refinement for teachers, so that the article that you read about thought partnering with AI, as I was working on that article, I was also building a professional development session on the exact same topic. And had the privilege of running that professional development session. I had so much fun with that session. But the point, what I wanted to bring it to is the interesting thing is the prompt refinement piece was only one small part of that PD. I would say at least 50% of that professional development session really was about shifting mindset, right? And the whole idea of teachers embracing prompt refinement has everything to do with shifting from an understanding of AI as not just simply, and I know this sounds redundant because we kind of touched on this, but not just simply as a time-saving tool, but as a tool that can enhance, your already effective craft or the things that you're already doing effectively. You can do it better if you embrace that mindset. So in addition to the time that, we spent on all of the prompting stuff, that was kind of towards the end. But before that, we looked at like the percentage of our AI use just for reducing workload versus for strengthening our output. We looked at teacher perception of student AI use and then teacher perception of like administrator AI use and feedback and communication. We looked at the gaps, right, between how we view our own AI use versus what we expect from others. So essentially examining this question, do you scrutinize your use of AI the same way you scrutinize student and administrator use of AI? And then just as important, we looked at this whole idea of AI dependence and cognitive offloading, which can then lead to cognitive atrophy. I read a really, really good piece on that during the school year. There's a blog, a Substack actually, by a gentleman named, I'm probably going to say his name wrong, but Nick Potkalitsky.
Okay.
And he has a Substack called Educating AI. And he had a guest post from someone named Nigel P. Daly. And that whole article was just about AI fluency, managing cognitive bleed, and AI dependency. And so we kind of looked at some of those ideas. And eventually, once we did all this mindset work, it got everyone to a place where they were super receptive to this idea of taking an iterative approach to using AI as a thought partner,
And I really like just, both of those pieces that you shared around the mindset shift and understanding, right, what goes into, right, a session that you might have with a chatbot where you're interacting, you're following up with a question, you're writing a prompt and making those, changes and refinements. And one thing you said that I think would be a really great tip for someone who is trying to accomplish those same goals is sharing the chat itself. A lot of these tools, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini, you can link out to what might feel like a transcript, right? Of I said this, the chatbot responded. This was my input. This is the next response. And it's a great way to show someone, sure, what's possible, right? So that might, address the mindset shift, but then also how you accomplished it, right? The practical piece of it. So I just wanted to point that out for people in case they missed it, because you mentioning that is such a great strategy for someone who is trying this out, has some good examples on their screen, and wants others to, explore a bit, or maybe, break it down like we would do a close reading of a text by having that, that piece. And, as you're having conversations, I know I experience this in the professional development that I do, there are plenty of valid things that come up, where people are hesitant to try this out or have some reservations around this technology. A lot of my conversations recently, it's been really interesting to hear some great questions around environmental impact, right? And just all these different things that we can talk about, around this type of technology. So I'm curious, what challenges or maybe even, misconceptions do you hear from educators about AI in the classroom, as part of their instructional practice?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I think probably the biggest misconception that I hear, is that AI doesn't belong in the classroom. I think that we are doing our students a disservice by not, kind of attacking this AI fluency piece, because the reality is students are using AI, whether they're using it with your express permission or not, they're using AI. And so I think that's a big misconception. One of the misconceptions that I see far too frequently is an over-reliance on AI as like an arbiter of truth, right? AI makes mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you use it long enough, if you use it long enough, taking that iterative approach, you're gonna find the mistakes, right? And it's gonna change the way you prompt. It's gonna change your workflow, because then you kind of start to understand and identify patterns and ways to mitigate those mistakes. AI is not perfect. I think that's a big challenge. The other two challenges I would say is that double standard. If you have a mindset that I want to use AI to reduce my workload, right? And it stops there. Well, why do you think a student is using AI to reduce their workload, right? Why would an administrator take your observation, throw it in ChatGPT to give you feedback instead of write it themselves to reduce their workload? And I'm not saying I would do that. And I'm not saying it's okay for a student to use AI to write an essay that they're supposed to be writing themselves. What I'm saying is that's a hypocrisy, right? That's a contradiction. So I think that kind of gap there is something that I see. And then the last thing I would say is definitely ethics, right? Like ethics is the biggest challenge. What are the ethics? And I'm so glad that you mentioned kind of the environmental toll. I work with some educators who are just absolutely opposed to AI because of the toll that it takes on our environment. And I don't have an answer for that, because I'm an educator. And what I understand intimately is that whether I want to use AI or not, the teachers that I'm working with are going to use it. The administrators are going to use it, but the students are going to use it, right? So how do we kind of reconcile all of these moving pieces in a responsible and ethical way? I don't have the answer to that.
And I think that's a continuing conversation for so many folks who are, starting a new school year, in the midst of, the school year, finishing out the school year, or any point right throughout the calendar year. There's these moments of deep conversation that they might have with their colleagues around the moments they choose to use certain technology, the best use cases, and of course, as you alluded to, just some of the transparency, right, to avoid the hypocrisy of I'm using this and you can't, or right, this was my choice in this moment, but you shouldn't make that choice in that moment, right, that you might have with different members of the school community. So, as we are finishing up together today, and, if there's a school leader, a teacher, an instructional supervisor who's still hesitant about AI use or is excited and just isn't quite sure where to start, what's one low stakes way you'd recommend they start exploring this technology?
Yeah, I would say super low stakes is look at one of the AI platforms that are made for education, right? It's right up your alley. If you're not involved with math, right? If you're one of the content areas that is highly dependent on words, a little bit more than math is, although math is dependent on words, I would say look at something like Diffit, right? And I think some buy-in for educators who are kind of on the fence about AI with a program like Diffit is that, multi-language learners, English language learners, right? Fastest growing student population in the country right now. Every school who has students who are learning the English language needs tools to be able to educate these students effectively. That's one of the things that Diffit does very easily, right? You can differentiate according to lexile level, reading level, grade level, and by language, right? So I would say play around with Diffit, come up with some assignments, whether you're a teacher or administrator. Another buy-in piece for administrators who's never used AI is, right now, with the teacher shortage, inevitably you're going to have substitutes in your building. If it is a great tool to ensure that you're aligning that substitute work while you're trying to hire, your 7th grade math teacher or wherever you're falling, your science teachers are the ones that are hardest to find. But, I think just play around with a tool like that, and you just be careful not to get addicted.
I love that recommendation because it gets someone focused on an AI-powered educational tool, right? So there's a way to really get them pointed, right, in that K-12 area, and that actionable tip to say, like, maybe it's a supplemental resource for this particular situation. Like, you're being called into a meeting on a Tuesday, period 7, right? And this is something that kids can work on independently, and then you can come back together and have a discussion about it. So, I think that's such a powerful example, because we've all been in that situation if we've been in the classroom before, and can see, how that would be a useful, right, use case. So, I really appreciate you taking the time to unpack these strategies and to share some great recommendations and resources with listeners. I'm going to put links out so anyone listening right now can click and find you and follow along. But for anyone who's kind of on the go right now and making that mental bookmark, where can listeners connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
Sure. So if you would like to connect on social media, I'm on Blue Sky, Amir Taron, that's AmirTaron.BSKY.SOCIAL. I am still on X, much to many people's chagrin. I really don't use it much, but but I get a lot of interaction there. So you can find me on X if you're still on there at Amir Taron Ed. That's AmirTaronEd. All of my education or my Edutopia articles are on my profile on Edutopia, and that's just my name, Amir Taron Ayres, AmirTaronAyres, not AYERS. Everyone misspells my last name, but it's AYRES. So those are the main areas where you can find me. I am also involved with a really great group of educators called the Empowerment Perspective Group. And if you are looking to find some really high quality PD, or just link up with some like-minded educators who are also creatives and, move in a number of different spheres, you can find us online at theempowermentperspective.com. So I think that's pretty much everything.
That's perfect. Well, thank you again for your time today. Lots of great resources for listeners.
Awesome.
This was such a fun conversation, so let's finish up like we always do with a few key points from today's episode. Productivity is a starting point, but true value comes from using AI as a thought partner. A shift in mindset is essential for moving from surface level to more intentional AI use. Sharing AI chat links is a practical strategy for collaboration and professional development. Starting with AI-powered education tools is a low-stakes, high-value entry point. Remember, you can find the show notes and full list of resources from today's episode, including all of the ways to connect with Amir Taron Ayres, by heading to easyedtechpodcast.com and finding today's episode. This episode is sponsored by my Amazon storefront. I've pulled together more than a dozen lists of my favorite gifts, books, and spring cleaning items for educators. My collections on Amazon make it easy to find all of my books written by Easy EdTech Podcast guests, and so much more. Use the link classtechtips.com/Amazon to go straight to my Amazon storefront. That's classtechtips.com/Amazon. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.